Excellent. Thank you, Stephanie. And Steph, can you bring up the poll that we were going to run first thing first? So this is a session about gamification and how to use gamification to enhance your training. And I want to start by first asking those of you who've considered using gamification in your programs, what's the biggest challenge that you face when you think about gamifying your learning program at your organization? Typically, the four answers I hear are, first, it's too expensive. It costs a lot to do these things. It takes a lot of time. The second is, wow, it's too hard to do. It's a very complicated, complex endeavor, and I just can't do that. The third, my boss won't support it. We in a lot of cases, regardless of what we're trying to do with our e-learning or our learning programs, we're trying to get our bosses to buy in, and a lot of times that's not the easiest thing to do. And finally, some of you may think gamification just doesn't make a difference. Why would I put that into my training program, spend all the time and the effort to do that, and I'm not going to see any sort of return? So if you could take a second and answer the poll there, and we'll come back to these results a little bit later in the presentation, but I want to see kind of where you all stand. So
So yeah, we'll give it one more second for everybody to click on the poll, and then I will share the results on the screen. Okay, let's take a look. Looks like the top two answers there are, it's too expensive and too hard.
Too hard to do. Excellent. Well, great to get those, get that feedback, and we'll come back to this. I want to hit each one of those 4 points, and as we go through this session, we'll talk about each of those, and at the end, we'll kind of wrap up with what that means for us. So let me share out my screen. All right. So what I want to share with you today is about a program that I built when I was working as a senior program manager at Amazon. We got a group of senior directors, senior general managers. Now, if you think about these folks, they're high-level senior directors who own all of the responsibility of operations for an entire country. So if you think about somebody who owns all of the operations for Germany, for example, or for India, what they're responsible for is managing all of the customer service agents, all of the operations, making sure that all of the deliveries get out, all of that. Heavily managed through metrics, heavily managed on a daily basis by the C-suite folks who want to look and say, you know, are you meeting all of your goals? Here are your quarterly objectives. Are you on track to meet all of those? And those folks, as you can imagine, in their daily lives, have a lot of decisions they need to make. Everything from, do I have enough staff on the floor? Do I have enough resources to support the customers who are contacting us? All of those sorts of decisions. They're also faced with some really large decisions beyond that come in that are what we would call high velocity decisions or high criticality decisions. Things like, as you may have seen recently in the news, we're going to have a layoff in 90 days. And how do I manage that while still maintaining all of our processes and maintaining all of our services to our customers over time? So we really want to figure out how we can help these folks make really high quality, high velocity decisions. Cut my page down. For some reason, it doesn't want to page down. Sorry about that. All right.
I just start every conference with just a few tech problems.
You know, it's PowerPoint. It's PowerPoint. That's the problem. All right. So I want to do a little bit of gamification 101 before we get started to make sure that everybody has kind of a baseline agreement and understanding about what we're talking about. I'm going to be very, very brief about this. I don't want anybody to feel like I'm talking down to you if you're already an expert on this, but I do want to make sure we have a common understanding. So when we talk about gamification, we are not talking about building games, right? And that's a lot of the places where in the poll, we talked about getting your boss to agree. Sometimes your boss doesn't understand what gamification is, and they think you're just trying to build something that's fun and that allows people to play while they're training. And while that may be part of the elements that you include, Gamification is the application of game elements in a non-game platform. So if you think about, for example, building out an e-learning program, I know a lot of you think about gamification as points, badges, and leaderboards, and those are certainly mechanics we can use, but there are a whole lot of other mechanics. In fact, Jonathan Peters and Monica Cornetti at Sententia Gamification have identified over 200 different game elements, different mechanics that you could use to gamify your learning program. Everything from building out timers to using scoreboards to creating interdependence among the players, all sorts of things. So the parts, when we talk about gamified design, we're really talking about three primary things. The first is personas. And a persona is not necessarily a person that is in the gamification, but it could be your learner persona, right? Who is this gamified program targeted to? And really wanting to understand in detail who they are, their demographics, their psychographics, what is their role in their job, what experience do they have, all of those things, because that leads into the second piece, which is what are their motivations? Are they a highly independent person who doesn't like to compete a lot? Are they very competitive? Do they prefer, instead of competitive, do they like collaborative games, right? All of that is going to help you determine how you design your gamified program, which leads from motivations into what we were talking about just a moment ago, which are the mechanics. Once you know the motivations of your learners, you can attach the appropriate mechanics to activate those motivations. The purpose in activating a motivation is simply to get somebody more engaged and more involved in your training program, because the more engaged they are, we do know that the more successful your program is going to be. Which leads to our third point there. Why do we use gamification? Ultimately, the purpose of gamification is to get your learners more engaged, more involved in your learning program. As a result, they have longer term retention of the materials, of the training that you've given them, of the information that they've gained in the program. And how do we know that's the case? There have been hundreds of studies particularly over the last 10 years or so, that demonstrate that gamification is a key element in helping your program be successful. One of the seminal studies on this was by Jihao and Zhang Zhen about 7-8 years ago, where they showed that gamification they did an A/B comparison, a non-gamified program versus gamified, and they found that the gamified program had at least a 10% improvement in long-term retention and in terms of completion rates. So if what you're shooting for here is, I not only want my people to get through the program, but I want them to be successful long-term after, gamification is a great way to get them involved that way. All right, so the goal we had for this program was to develop a model to train our general managers. And again, these are folks, senior level folks who own an entire country, on how to make high quality decisions under pressure. We can imagine that they're constantly getting pressure from even their managers, right? The C-suite, about you're not hitting your metrics, you're not hitting your numbers quite as fast as you are. So we said, we need to build a program that can mimic what their real life experience is like, right? We want to make sure that we put them in an environment that gives them the opportunity to practice what they're doing on a daily basis. But we were also given some pretty critical limits when we were putting this together. I was actually assigned this program by one of our C-suite executives, and he said, we really need to do this because we've noticed that our general managers are really good at some kinds of decisions, particularly the day-to-day operational decisions, but not so good at some other kinds of more critical decisions. So we really need to train them. But hey, by the way, you only get 3 days with them. And of course, the reason is that these people are very expensive, right? We can't take them out of their operational duties for more than a few days before we see things start to fall apart. So we were given a 3-day limit. And by the way, when the program's done, you need to be able to demonstrate that there's been a return on the investment. For those of you not familiar with ROI, basically what that means is we have to have more benefit from this program, measurable benefit, than the cost to create and present the program, right? And we'll get into that as we go through this. All right, so the process we went through, and this is a process that I want to highly recommend that if you think about doing a gamified approach, you go through this exact same process, because I think this is a really foundational and structured way of putting together your program. The first, for us, the program was about decision making. So we went out and looked at different types of decision making models. And we also researched how these decision makers had been trained before on how to make decisions. Interestingly, they hadn't been. We basically made the assumption that because they got hired into this very high level position, they clearly must already have a structured format for making decisions. They already know how to do it very well. So we don't need to teach them anything else. Clearly not the best approach when you're putting somebody into a position where they are daily making decisions that are critical to the business and really have distinct impact. So the second thing we did is we conducted individual interviews with the managers and the employees. So I went and met with each of these managers. I said, tell me about what your daily life is like. Tell me about the kinds of decisions that you're faced with. How do you make those decisions? Really trying to understand what it is they go through and what that mindset is as they have a decision that comes up. I also wanted to document some of the real major problems they faced. And you'll see why in a minute. And we're going to share out after this session a spreadsheet with you that if you wanted to model this exact same kind of decision-making training for your managers, you could use the framework that we built. So we asked them about, what are the really big problems that you faced in the last 12 months? Tell me about those. Tell me about where they came from, how you made decisions, etc. The second piece, though, is there are these sort of incidental events and issues that come up, right? Any of you who are in a decision-making capacity know that very seldom is it that you have just one decision to make at a time, right? You're thinking through, for example, recently I've been going through a home remodel here at home, and there's the bigger issues of, we have to get the permits and we have to find the right people to do this work or that work. But at the same time, we're having to make all sorts of little decisions about colors and about style and design and all of that. And those compete, right? The more you spend time on one decision, the less time you have for another decision. So we wanted to really understand kind of what those other incidental events were that these folks are making. And then finally, I wanted to document what is the decision-making process they actually were going through? What were the step-by-step mechanisms they were using as they were thinking through, here's this major problem, how do I get to a resolution? Once we had all that sort of collated and we did that research, the next thing I did is I went out to each of the sites, and there are 13 sites that we went to, and I did site observations. I literally just spent a couple of days at each site, and all I did was wander around, kind of follow these decision makers around, followed around some of their managers, the folks that report into them, to just see what the process was. How is that working, right? What are they doing? How are they making decisions? What kinds of decisions are coming up? What happens as they're making decisions? All of that, really trying to flesh out what is that on the ground experience that they have that we want to try and model out in our program. And then finally, I mentioned that we reviewed their previous training, and for virtually all of them, it was, I haven't really had any. I've gleaned my decision-making expertise over a number of years in my career, but nobody's really given me a framework or a model for how to do that. That was one of the most critical findings in our research. And what we decided was, as part of our program, the first step was we needed to be able to teach these folks a true model for making decisions. All right, so as we were thinking about the challenges that these folks have as they're making decisions, we came up with a number, 4 or 5 kind of real priority pieces. The first is that their decision making had a clearly operational focus. How many customers did they serve today? What was the average time for a customer call, right? Really operational metrics. They didn't, in many cases, interestingly, again, these are folks who manage an entire country. They weren't looking at things as much from a strategic decision making because they were so wrapped up in the operational pieces of what they had to do. And that was because of what the expectations were from the C-suite, right? You need to hit those metrics, you need to hit those numbers. The second thing we saw was that they had a very competitive focus. My country or my site is better than that country, right? When I went to India, they were very, very proud. In fact, they had a leaderboard, and the only site that had this, but they had a leaderboard that showed the Indian sites versus all of the sites at the other countries around the world. And they were really proud to say, look, our top 3 sites are the top 3 sites in the world for these operational metrics, right? So there was this really high competition level. And if you think about going back to motivations, as we started thinking about building out this program, that was a clear motivation that we saw from all of the sites. And we said, we need to build that in as we gamify our program. The third is that they have time pressures, right? One of the key metrics for any operational site is how quickly can you do X? Whether that's you work in a warehouse and you need to get the order out, right? How many orders can you pick in an hour and send out? If you're a customer service site, how many customers can we serve in an hour and resolve their problems, right? So there's all of these time pressures that they're under that we needed to make sure we captured as we're thinking about building this program. And then finally, we came up with one, this was really fascinating to us, information challenges. I made the assumption going in that when a senior manager is going to make a decision, they've done tons of research, they've got all of the information they could possibly need, right? It becomes almost a formulaic approach, but that was really not the case. Instead, what we found is they had some really superfluous information at times, stuff that really didn't matter. They had conflicting information from their team members, right? So they might be making a decision about layoffs. So they've got their HR manager is there working with them. They've got their team supervisors working with them. They've got the managers who report in there working with them. And each of those people is giving them information, but it may not all match. There may be some conflicting information in there that they need to sort through. Along those same lines, they often get inaccurate information, right? People are giving you information in the moment as quickly as they can and to the best of their knowledge. And sometimes that's not the most accurate information. They may get stuff that doesn't really match up with reality. Similarly, it's incomplete. And a lot of that's because of the time pressures, right? I need an answer right now. Get me as much information as you can right now. Okay, well, here's what I have today at whatever time it is, 10:20 in the morning on the East Coast. But if you come back in 3 hours, I'm going to have more information. Or if you come back tomorrow, I'll have more information. And not only will it be more complete, it'll probably be more accurate. They also have competing priorities. And we talked about this just a few minutes ago, where I'm making a decision about one thing, but at the same time, I've got 2 or 3 other decisions that I've got to try and make, right? I've got these things that are competing for my time, competing for my brain power. And then lastly, being able to ascertain the criticality of a decision, right? How important is it to make this decision right now in this moment? Or can I set it aside for a little bit and come back to it? So as we thought about how we're going to build out our gamified approach, this was really key to make sure that we included all of these challenges and make sure we leverage that as we go forward. All right. So what we came up with is what we called high velocity decision making, the gamified experience. And we actually came up with 3 or 4 different ideas. Going back to the research that we did, we came up with some game elements to use that activate their motivations and that tie directly to those things we were just talking about those. So let's go through kind of what we came up with. Going back to the poll, several of you said, well, this is a costly thing to do, right? Gamifying your training program is very costly. And that was certainly a pressure that we had. We were told, you know, you've got to do this program, but you don't have a lot of budget. You can't go out and hire a bunch of developers to build out an e-learning game with, you know, that's going to cost us $100,000 to build out with fancy graphics, etc. You need to come up with a different way of doing so that doesn't cost a lot of money. So we came up with a completely analog approach, a card-based experience, and I will not call it a game because it wasn't a game, a card-based training program, learning experience to help work through the decision-making process. So the first thing we did is, as I said, we went out and did some research on decision-making frameworks. So we scheduled a one-day session with all of these leaders. We gathered them in Barcelona, Spain, which was beautiful. And remember, I was told I only have 3 days to train these folks. And I said, I think I can do it in one. Let's see what we can do here. So we brought them all to Barcelona. And I first presented them, excuse me, with a research-driven approach to decision-making. We have a very strict, formalized model with step-by-step approach to how to make particularly critical decisions. And we said, okay, we're going to look at how you would use that research-based approach in solving the problems that you get on a daily basis. And what we came up with, you see this card on the screen, this is what we called a problem card. These are the big problems that our global managers told us. These are the things we've had to deal with in the last 12 months. You can see on the screen, the example we have here is a site closure. One of our GMs was told in the next 8 weeks, you're going to have to close site X. This was way pre-pandemic, so not something recent. But you're going to have to close this, and we're going to relocate to a new building. And there's a whole lot of stuff that goes involved with that, right? You got to figure out how you're going to tell your people. You got to figure out how you're going to maintain your operations as you transfer from one building to the next. You need to manage security around your data, all of those sorts of things. And as part of the decision-making process, if you look here on the card, you'll see that there were a number of different steps. The first was gathering information. The second was communicating out to the appropriate people. The third was evaluating potential solutions, then selecting a solution, implementing that solution, and then ultimately evaluating how did you do. So that was the framework that we taught them. So in this card game, what we did is we said, okay, we're going to put you in teams of 5. And the 5 people are going to be the GM, and this was with all of the GMs. So we put them in different roles as part of this card game. You're gonna have a GM, you're gonna have somebody who's the HR manager, you're gonna have somebody who is the IT manager, you're gonna have somebody who is the, we called it GREF, the real estate and facilities manager. And then the last one is going to be an operations person, right? Could be an operations supervisor. So we put these teams together and we said, here's how the game is played. We're going to give you a problem. And depending on the criticality of the problem, you are either going to have 5 minutes or 8 minutes to solve that problem using the structured approach. And we had a score sheet to, as they were working through this, this problem, where we tracked, were they using all of the steps in the approach. You can see based on not only the color of the card, but down here at the bottom, you see it says 5. This is a 5-minute card. I'm sorry, this is a 10-minute card. I don't know why this has a 5 there. This is a 10-minute card. So meaning it's not super critical. It's not something that in real life would have to be resolved right now, but you'd have some time to think about it. Again, this is an 8-week thing, right? And what we wanted them to do was within their team, think through all of the different incidental pieces that they need to make sure they were aware of and resolve this problem. Now, remember, I said we're trying to mimic the real world with this. So the very first thing we did is say, well, you know, when these GMs are out there making decisions about this big problem, they also get these events that come up. These are those incidental events and issues that we talked about just a little while ago, right? So I'm making this big decision, but at the same time, I'm getting all these other things kind of thrown at me. Again, these are real life events and issues that we collected from all of the GMs. We didn't make any of this stuff up. So in this case, they might be faced with a rodent infestation in their site's kitchen. The way we had these events come in is we set a random timer. And within this 10 minutes, they may get one event, they may get 10 events that pop up while they're trying to make a decision about this problem. The reason that's critical is if they do not make the decision in 10 minutes, then they lose a bunch of points, right? This is worth a certain number of points. And as they're going through and making these decisions, you can see they can, based on what they do here, they can get the full points or they can lose points if they don't follow all of the steps. And if they don't get done in the time, obviously they are not going to get all of the points, right, when the time is up. So the more events that are thrown at them, the less likely they are to resolve the problem. Now, at the same time, we talked about information and the kind of information that may be presented to them. They can ask one of their team members. Let's say they have a question about, as they're thinking about moving this site, they have a question about how that's going to work with their IT. They could reach out to their IT manager and say, hey, I need some more information about this. And their IT person can give them an information card and say, here's some more information that might support your decision-making on this problem. Again, the information that they're given may be relevant, may not, may be accurate, may not, may be incomplete, right? So all of these things that we saw in real life were playing out in this card experience. Now, here's where it got fascinating. As I mentioned, these folks are highly competitive, were highly competitive in their real life. So this was built as a competitive gamified experience, right? We put people in teams. We told them up front, the team that gets the most points, the team that is most successful over, I think we did 4 rounds of this experience with each team. The team that ends up with the most points is going to get a prize, right? Highly competitive. Here's where it got fascinating to me. We got into the first round of the first team, and the GM who was trying to solve the problem got stuck and was kind of working through it and struggling with it and getting information and really was going down the wrong path. And here's where the fascinating piece took place. All of the other GMs who were just observing, they were not on his team, jumped in. Remember, this was a competitive experience. That all went away. They started throwing in, hey, I had a problem similar to that. Here's what I did in that situation. This became instantly a collaborative process, a collaborative effort. Instead of fighting with one another, instead of saying, ooh, my numbers are better than your numbers, they got into, this is our numbers. How do we as a company, rather than my site versus your site, how do we as an organization work together to make the best decisions we possibly can? And we did this, I thought, okay, maybe that's just the first round, the first, right? And so we finished that group and we got another group. I said, just reminding you, the team that gets the most points is going to get a prize. Didn't matter. Next group got up, exact same thing happened. Really, really fascinating, powerful results. So, okay, we also heard from some of you, how do I know it's going to work? Well, let me give you just 2 things. The first I said earlier on was that there are hundreds of studies out there that demonstrate the gamification works. Here's what we saw in this particular program. Decision failure, which is the biggest metric in this program, was reduced by 10% year over year. That is huge. When you think about a company the size of Amazon, improving your decisions by 10%, equates to millions of dollars. We also were able to improve decision time, meaning reducing decision time by 5% year over year. Interestingly, people really liked the program. That's always good, right? We like to know that if we build something, we got an evaluation of 4.4 out of 5 and a net promoter score of 60. What really heartened me, made me feel good about this, was that those GMs then said, you know what? I think this program was so powerful, so useful. I want you to include all of the local managers. And that's thousands of managers worldwide. And we said, well, that's really great. However, you can't really scale a card experience like that to literally thousands of people. So we said, okay, we're going to do this differently. Let's now turn it into a digital experience. And I know, Stephanie, I've got what, about 5 to 7 minutes left?
Yes, you have plenty of time.
Okay, perfect. So we said, let's make a digital experience out of it. One of the challenges with that is that our managers worldwide all deal with different things. So coming up with a standard set of problems and issues and all of that, very, very difficult. Second, as I said, you can't really scale a card game. So we said, all right, we're going to build an e-learning version of this same program. And we want to keep those same gamified elements. It needs to have some time element to it, something where if you make the wrong decision, you suffer a loss of some sort as a result. It needs to be something where you have lots of additional information coming in, and some of it's good and some of it's bad, etc. It does need to be engaging, right? We need to make sure that people want to do this. Since there's not somebody engaging like myself standing in the room running this program in a bright red jacket, we need to make it something that they want to go through. If this was just your standard e-learning, here's a 7-step decision-making process. Step 1, do this. People aren't going to want to go through it, right? We're definitely not going to get them to finish it. And we wanted to have a model that reinforced the right behavior, right? If they make a good decision, if they use the right resources, whatever it is, we want to make sure that they're getting feedback in the moment that says, yep, you made the right decision, or conversely, oops, not quite right. So what we've done is we created an e-learning experience based on the concept of an escape room, right? Everybody loves a good escape room. Now, you look at this and you go, oh my gosh, that must have been super expensive to make that. Look at all those great graphics and everything. I'm going to tell you that everything you see on the screen, and in fact, everything we used in the entire e-learning experience cost us about $200. You can go out on the web. There are companies that you can buy full packs of e-learning game pieces. And there might be one that you're familiar with. I think they're called ELB, where they have all sorts of resources that you can purchase. This is from a specific game element design company. And again, the whole pack costs us, I don't even think it costs $200, but at most we spent about $200 for it. And the idea here is that you go through and you click on these different things. And I wish I could have shown you in real time. But for example, let's imagine that you click on this fuse panel over here. What you might see is something that pops up that says the electricity to the computer cooling section has disengaged. And it gives you a couple of options. What do you want to do about this? And one of them is, I want to hit it with a hammer. A second is, I'm going to go to the tools and grab a wrench and see if I can fix it. And the third is, I'm going to unplug it and plug it back in, right? Whatever. By making those decisions, you either get, you're successful or you're not. If you're not successful, obviously you've been delayed. It's taken you longer to get through it. And you'll get some feedback. Hey, this wasn't the greatest decision. Maybe what you should have done is gotten additional information. And there are ways in here, if you were to go to the ship's menu up top, you can actually contact your your support within the ship, right? So there's an electrician, there's a communications specialist, just like we had in the other gamified experience. You can get additional information. Now, again, what you see here looks relatively complicated. Basically, it is an e-learning experience that is built with a lot of variables and a lot of triggers. And if you're familiar with those two things, you can build this out. What was really interesting, this could be built in any e-learning package. So you could use Lectora to do this. You could use Storyline, whatever is your favorite tool. There's nothing particularly special about how we built it. But one of the fascinating pieces is, I don't know if you can see it, over here, this is actually a bay door, because if you look up here in the top right corner, there's a map of your entire area and where you're at and where you're trying to go. Well, when you get to like this bay door, for example, and you try and open it, it says, sorry, you can't open it, you don't have the key. What would you like to do? One of the options is I'm going to run into the door with my spaceship. Well, the result of that obviously comes back and says, that's not the right way to open a door. And by the way, because you made a bad decision, this clock that you see down here in the bottom corner, you've now lost 2 minutes, right? So just like we had in the analog version of this game, this gamified experience, you have a time pressure. You have 30 minutes to solve this. And as you make good decisions, you get through quickly. If you make poor decisions, you lose time. That is your time element that puts pressure on the decision making, just like in the real world when you're trying to make decisions and you make a bad decision. Well, that's puts you off of your decision making route, right? And that's taken some of your time away. And we wanted to make sure that we give that same element in here. So we built this out. We rolled it out to approximately 5,000 managers worldwide. And very similar to the GMs, we weren't able to track some of the same metrics. We got very positive feedback on this. People really liked it. And we were asked to roll it out to a broader audience. So the biggest piece about this that I want to reinforce is none of this was hard, right? It took a little time, and the biggest time was the research up front. And as you're building out a gamified experience, I highly recommend that you take that time up front, because the more you do up front, the easier all the rest of it's going to be. The expense, again, if we look at the card-based experience, the expense was our time of designing it and developing it. The cards are $12 a pack. You could build out, in fact, you can build out as many packs as you want. We have them all in Adobe InDesign, so we can change the images anytime we want. The template we're going to share with you, you'll see how we framed out all of the problems and all of the issues. And in fact, in the spreadsheet, you're going to see my initial really bad scratch drawings of what the cards might look like as we were thinking through it. In terms of your bosses and making sure your bosses are bought off, I would say, again, if you do your research up front, you can come with numbers galore and say, look, here are 14 different programs that have used gamification, and here's the actual ROI. Here are the numbers that they hit, which are better than non-gamified experiences. And then, finally, that there's no difference between a gamified and not gamified. I think, first of all, we've shown with some of the metrics that we got, particularly from the GMs, that it was a much better experience. The second thing I would say is just think about, and as we talked about this e-learning course, you've got two different experiences. Let's imagine you were doing a compliance course, right? You need people to learn all about cybersecurity. Many of us have seen what I would call PowerPoint with a next button cybersecurity courses, right? Where this is phishing. Don't click on a link in your email. This is this, blah, 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 blah. And about 3 slides in, you're drooling on your keyboard because it's the most boring thing you've ever gone through. And as a result, you're not paying attention, you're not learning, and you're sure as heck not going to retain any of that information. Flip side, you make it something engaging, something interesting, maybe create some scenarios, right? Some gamified scenarios where you have a character going through a phishing experience, and then at the end you have to resolve it, right? What would you do in this situation? How would you, if you were given a phishing email and maybe you made a mistake, how would you resolve that, right? All of those things, all of a sudden you got somebody engaged. They're like, oh, I'm bought in now. So think about it from that perspective. I think the last thing I want to say about this is, when it comes to gamification, you don't have to start big. Everybody makes the assumption, I've got this program, I want to gamify it. So for example, maybe you've got a new hire program, right? A new employee orientation program. And right now it's a week-long thing. You go, oh man, how am I going to gamify a week-long program to really make it the best thing ever? Don't. Start with one element within that program. Maybe there's a piece about benefits, HR and benefits, right? Do something around that piece. Get some results, get some feedback from the people who are going through the program, what they like, what didn't they like, what resonated for them, what didn't work so well. Then go to the next one and the next one. And pretty soon you're gonna find that it becomes much easier to do a large program because you kind of chunked it off one by one. And you can build out a broader concept around how to do this. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. I hope we've kicked this ELBX off well, and I encourage you all to stay on for the rest of the 3 days of sessions. I know there's some really excellent speakers, and thanks for taking your time this morning.
All right, thank you so much, Chuck. Now don't run away yet, because we do
No,
have
I'm
a
not going
few
in.
questions for you. And I did post a link in the chat to that Excel spreadsheet that you mentioned for everyone.
Excellent.
That link will also be shared with the recording, so don't worry. Now let's get into these questions. First, can you do a brief explanation of the Net Promoter Score, the NPS scale, for those who might not be familiar with it, and if 60 is a good number or not?
Sure.
That's key.
Sure. So Net Promoter Score is something that actually comes from the marketing industry. If you do market research, it scales from 0 to 100. The way you collect it is you ask people at the end of a program or in a marketing program, you know, how likely are you to recommend this program or this X, whatever it is, to someone else? And it's on a 1 to 10 scale. And you use the 9 and 10. Those are what they call promoters, right? So what percentage of people said 9 and 10, and you subtract everybody who said 1 to 3. So if you had 80% who said 9 to 10 and 20% who said 1 to 3, your net score is 60, right? Now that's never gonna happen. You're never gonna be bifurcated like that, right? You might have 60% who said 9 to 10, 30% who said 3 to 8, and 10%, whatever the remainder is, at the lower end, right? Anything, depends who you ask, anything above 60 and above is considered a good score. Obviously, I'd love to see 70, 80, 90, but yeah, no, very seldom happens.
Yes. All right, thank you for that explanation. Somewhat related, we had several people want to know, what metrics were you looking at when you calculated the ROI for this program?
Yep, excuse me. So again, we looked at primarily the decision-making quality and decision-making time, right? We were able to go back, and I can't get into too much detail, but we were able to put dollar amounts, tie dollar amounts to decision-making success. So each correct decision was worth a certain number of dollars. And we were able to look pre the program and say, we made 90% of our decisions were the right decisions, so that's worth X number of dollars. Now we're making 95% of our decisions are right decisions. That's worth Y dollars. The difference is a certain amount. And we knew that developing the program and presenting the program, we were able to very easily calculate the costs. And when you calculate the costs for your cost section, you need to include everything. So it was our development costs, our research costs, all of our travel costs, me going to all of the sites, all of the costs of the GMs traveling for the training, the time in the training, all of that needed to be included in the cost.
Perfect. Let's see, other questions. What program did you use to build the cards that you showed earlier in your presentation?
Primarily Adobe InDesign. It was the Adobe Creative Suite overall.
Perfect. Have you tried using H5P to build this? Which I did in fact have to Google, and Google told me that is HTML5.
Oh, we did not, mostly because it was a whole lot easier to not, right? I mean, the fact that we're able to use an off-the-shelf e-learning development suite to create this, it's the easiest way to do it. You don't need to have anybody who's got advanced programming skills. You don't need to have anybody, in this case, you don't have to have somebody who's a graphic designer, because none of the elements were, we didn't draw any of the elements. Everything was purchased.
Perfect. All right. Yeah, that sounds much easier than any coding and programming. All right, we've got one more question. How can you find out how much of what you teach your trainees is actually then used in their day-to-day processes?
Yeah, that's a great, I would say there are two
Eternal
ways.
question.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. There are actually two ways I would recommend. The first, as most people can imagine, is a survey, right? You can follow up just like we do with our learners on any L3 survey, right? How much of what you learned in this class are you currently using in your job, blah, 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 blah. And that's okay, right? Part of it requires that they remember what you taught them. and part of it requires that they're honest about it. The second way that I happen to think is more useful, but more costly, is actual observation, right? For something like this, other than saying, oh, they went through this training and now, gosh, we can literally see in the metrics that their decision-making has improved, right? That's based on the outcomes that we're seeing, good decisions, we can calculate that. But are they using the model that we taught them? Are they going through the process that we taught them? Really, the only way you're going to be able to see that is to observe or to have one-on-one interviews with them. And in this case, we didn't do this, but it just occurs to me that one of the things that would have been really interesting is to observe and see long-term how much behavioral change there was in the competition versus collaboration of the GMs, right? We saw that in practice in the experience. They went from, hey, we're going to get the best score, we're going to beat you, to all of a sudden, hey, we're going to work together for the betterment of the entire organization. Did that carry over long term when they went back to their jobs? That would be fascinating to me to go back and find out. And frankly, we didn't follow up that way, but I'd love to.
Yes. All right. Somewhat related to that, how did you decide what were the correct decisions in the scenarios? Did you work with subject matter experts?
Yeah, well, we worked with the subject matter experts we worked with were the GMs. And remember, these were decisions that they had made previously. So they had the experience. They knew, here's the best part. They knew the decisions they made, and they were able to go, oh, that was the right decision, versus I made this decision, and then as a result, we had these challenges, right? Things came up that weren't quite right. So that was, for the scenarios we gave them, that was a really easy one. There were some, particularly with the events, the things that were sort of the supplemental issues, that it was more difficult. And so what we decided to do is rank the quality of a decision. So I'll give one very silly example, which I actually observed when I was down in Phoenix, Arizona. Each of the sites works 3 shifts. Well, at this particular site, one of the things they gave as a kind of a perk for people working at the site was they got popcorn, right? There was always popcorn in the popcorn machine. So somebody, the operations manager, would go out, buy popcorn at Costco, bring it back, and they could make popcorn. Well, I was at the site in Phoenix in the late afternoon, so we were into the 3rd shift, and somebody came storming into the GM's office. Now, again, this is the GM. This is not just a manager. This is somebody who's a global or a country level owner. They came storming in and said, I am so tired of this. Every single day I come in, and by the time we get here, the morning and afternoon shifts have eaten all the popcorn, and we never get any popcorn. And for this person, that was a big, big deal, right? Was it really a big deal? Maybe, maybe not. But for them, it was important. So what decision does the GM make in that moment? Now, the decision he made was to tell the operations manager that, okay, you need to buy 3 bags of popcorn. You need to label them morning, afternoon, evening, right? So each shift had their own popcorn. They're, nobody's going to steal your popcorn, kind of thing. Was that the right decision? Maybe. There were a couple of other ways he could have gone about it, right? He could have said, tough luck, you're not going to get, whatever happens, happens. He could have made an announcement. So we kind of came up with 3 different levels of decision on that and said, okay, the top one is worth 10 points, the middle one is worth 7, and the bottom one is worth 3 or 5, whatever. And kind of ran that by people and said, yeah, that seems to make some sort of sense.
All right. I mean, when you got to have your popcorn, you got to have your popcorn.
Can I give one more example?
Sure, absolutely. I'll give, one more, and then and I'm going to have to cut you off.
Last one. As y'all are thinking about things like this, it was fascinating. So I was at a site in India, and they were facing impending layoffs, and the layoffs were going to be like in a week. So they were coming up pretty quickly, and I was in with the GM who was working with the senior HR person and somebody else. I think the operations manager was in there. And they're trying to figure out how are we going to tell the staff, what are we going to do in terms of compensation packages, all of those sorts of things. And while they're in there, a woman comes into the office and says, closes the door and says, I need to make a complaint right now about sexual harassment out on the floor. I was just sexually harassed and I need to deal with this right now. So what do you do? Right now, is that a problem and an issue, or is that now 2 big problems that you've got to deal with? Right. And going through that, the machinations of how do I prioritize there, and just watching, this is where observation comes in so powerfully. Just watching how that group of people worked together to figure out which decisions do we deal with first, which decisions do we kind of put off for a second, how do we manage that? Just a really, really fascinating experience to go through as a developer.